about exposing complex types. So it's okay exposing strings and collections of strings and so on, but we've already mentioned that if we want to expose complex types, i.e. records or rows, if you're talking to a database, then we need a way of doing that, and the way we do that is through model classes. So whenever we want to expose a piece of complex data, we're going to define a model class, and we're then going to use that class to define inbound or outbound parameters to our operation methods, and so on. And Web API is going to take care of all the serialization and deserialization that's necessary for us to do that. These model classes can be simple POCO, plain old CLR object classes, or they can get quite complex. You can set up entire hierarchies where one of the properties of this object is a whole collection of other objects that has its collections, and essentially you can wind up with a whole hierarchy. And when you're describing your model classes, essentially you're describing the hierarchy of the JSON that you're going to wind up sending over the wire. So everything's valid. You can have array properties, you can have collection properties, collections of objects with other properties and other collections, and so on. Like I say, it's going to be serialized and deserialized to either JSON, in which case it uses Newtonsoft.json, or to XML, because the .NET framework itself has inherent support for serializing and deserializing XML. So there's nothing special that needs to get provided for that to happen. As with the methods and controller classes that we've already seen, it's a good practice to use documentation comments, both on the model type and on the individual properties, and that documentation will come through in the underlying API documentation that's created. So let's look at an example of creating a complex type. We're going to start off fairly simple. I'm not going to dive straight into big complex ISAM files at this point in time. Let's just hard code an example, but we are going to do it using some more realistic data. So what we're going to do is let's start off and create ourselves a model class. So I'm going to go to my Synergy code. I am going to the property, add a new class, and we'll call that class person. There's our new person class, and I'm going to add 3 properties to it. We'll use the new syntax, so we'll say public read write property ID, comma, int. There is also a snippet for this, so we could do the prop auto. We'll call it first name is a string, and prop auto last name is also a string. So there's a simple model class that has an ID, a first name, and a last name. Let's put some documentation comments on here quickly. So let's say semicolon, 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 tab represents a person. And then let's just briefly put person ID, first name, and last name. And we should see that documentation coming through in the code. Let's do a quick build to validate our syntax primarily, and everything is building still. And now we've got a new model class that we can start exposing. So let's go create a new API controller now. So I'm going to go to our controllers class, and I'm going to say project add class. We'll call it people controller. And we are going to want this people controller to extend API controller. That's not in a namespace that we've got imported so far. That class lives in the system web HTTP namespace, so we'll use the control period shortcut to say, okay, we think we should import system web HTTP. So we'll bring that namespace in. I'm going to hard code some data. So what I'm going to do first of all is, so that we can get an example up and running really quickly, I'm just going to declare a private static variable of type list of person. So it's just a collection of person objects. Again, our person is in the models namespace, which we don't have, so we'll do a control period to bring in the import statement needed. And then we'll use the constructor snippet, so we can run some code when an instance of this controller is first created. And I'm just going to drop in there a little piece of code that basically says if people is null, so if we haven't previously created this collection of people, then people is new list of person. And again, if you're not familiar with this syntax, it's essentially initial values for a collection. So we're saying new list of person, new person, and there's initial values for the properties of that person. So we're creating two person objects and putting them into the people collection. Let's just make sure that syntax is happy by doing a quick build. Yeah. And then now we can start implementing our operations on this class. So first of all, we're going to have a simple get method that is called via an HTTP get and returns a collection of people. So I could use list of person, enumerable of person, it doesn't really matter as long as I express some collection type. And all that get method is going to do is return people. Remember, that's our collection of these two hard-coded people that we've just created up here. So there's our first basically simple operation. Good practice, let's add our documentation comment. So we'll do semicolons and say returns a collection of all people. Let's put a comment on the controller itself. Exposes actions relating to people, just so we've got something showing up. Okay, and there's a simple little controller. So let's do a build. Again, just doing that regularly just to check my syntax. And let's launch the thing and see what happens. So we'll do a control F5, which is run without debugging. There's always a delay because it's now doing the just-in-time compile underneath IIS. And there's our service homepage. And you can see we're now picking up, here's our values controller that was in the code we converted from C#. And here's the controller that we just wrote. There's our doc comment, and we can see we've already got a HTTP get action, API people, and if we click into it, now we're getting some more interesting information because it's telling us it returns collection of person, and it's giving us information about the properties of person, the descriptions that it's getting from the doc comments, the data types, integers and strings and so on, and additional information none. Okay, we'll see later how we can start to inject additional information in there, like this is required, this has to be one of these values, that kind of thing, to give developer information about how to use it, what to expect. And again, as we would expect, it's giving us a simple sample of what the resulting data would look like. There are ways, by the way, that you can override the sample code that's generated for each model type and make it look a bit more realistic and inject phone numbers into phone number fields and things like that. By default, it just tends to say sample number 1, sample string 2, things like that. But all of this can be enhanced very much so with a little bit of extra work. And there's our XML example too. Let's go put together a Postman test for this. So what we're going to do is run up Postman. Okay, so let's create a new Postman collection, and we'll call this people controller tests. And then into that collection, we'll create a new item, and we're going to be doing a get to base address API people. By the way, I switched environments. I'm now in workshop demo, which is pointing at the service that we're creating under my IIS. So API/people. We're not sending any information, so we don't have to provide any HTTP headers. We pretty much should be good to go. So I'm going to save that as get all people. And, you have to tell it which collection it goes into, people controller tests. And let's execute it, and there's our result. Okay, so that basically called into the Synergy.net controller that we just created, and there's the little collection of 2 items that we manually hard-coded. So there's our get action. Also notice we're getting a 200 OK result back, which is the correct response to this type of request. A 200 OK, remember, says success and I am returning content. Okay, so that is the appropriate thing in this case. Again, remember, the data isn't actually looking like this. We're in the pretty view right now because it knows it's JSON. It knows that because there was a response header that said content type is application JSON. So Postman has stepped in and said, okay, I'll make it look pretty for you. If we select raw, that's what actually came back from the service. Okay, which is obviously more efficient because it doesn't have a bunch of unnecessary carriage return line feeds in there. Okay. All right, so there's our example. Let's have another action. So I'm going to flip back to our Visual Studio environment, and I'm going to continue just dropping in and talking about. There's our get action. Let's drop another action in here, and we'll add some documentation comments, returns a single person. I think you get the idea. I'm not going to go through all the details of typing all this stuff in. So what we've got here is a method called get. So instead of returning an IEnumerable or a list of or whatever, a collection of person, we're now just returning at person, a single person object. And notice we've also got a required parameter in int. Okay? So the pattern of this method, remember that default routing we talked about earlier? It was API, controller, optional ID. This single int parameter will match that optional ID, and it will hook things together and call it when it sees that kind of URL. Again, if you're not familiar with this kind of syntax, we're doing a little bit of link here, so I will need to, we'll do it this way. We do need to import the system.link namespace. And what this does, people is a collection. There is an extension method, which is link, which is called first or default. So it basically defines this lambda, calls this lambda against the members of the collection, and when it finds a person object whose ID equals the ID passed in, it returns that member of the collection. So essentially, people.firstOrDefault is filtering the collection down to the one whose ID matches, essentially. And we're returning that. First or default, if it's not found, it will return a default representation of person, and a default representation of an object is null. Okay, so this method will return null if I give it a person who's not found. So there's that. We've put some doc comments in there. So let's build that, and while it's doing that, we'll zip on over to Postman. And I'm just going to copy this one. In fact, we'll just add on a /1. That's really the only difference. And then we'll do a save as get person 1 and save that. And then if we execute it, again, just-in-time compile under IIS, and there's person 1. Okay? And again, notice we've got the 200 OK status by default. So if we return something normally, Web API will just say, okay, it's a 200 OK. We'll talk about return values and stuff as we get more into this. Let's just prove the point. If we give it something that doesn't exist, like an 11, then we're still getting a 200 OK, because we haven't told Web API something wrong, but we've just returned a null value, which we've not done anything about at this point. I agree it's not particularly ideal. It's not correct. We should be returning a not found, but we'll come on to that. Okay, but this is default behavior. Okay, let's put that back to the one that does work, and there we go. And of course, obviously, if we do number 2, there's our Jane Doe. So there's our collection of 2. Okay, all right, let's look at what it takes to create something. So we're going to add another operation into our code. I'm going to copy this. This is where the selection of the next ID comes in that wasn't in the previous example, because it wasn't in my complete solution. So we'll go back into our Synergy.NET controller class, and I'm just going to paste in yet another operation. This time it's a post. I'll put the doc comments on there just to remind us, but I'm not going to take the time to fill them in right now. So this one's a little bit different. This one's taking data in, but it's not a simple string or integer that just matches a parameter from the query string. So in Web API, what we do is we use this from body attribute, which is, I think it would probably work without, because it knows it's a complex type. It can't possibly come through the query string. It must be in the body. But it's basically a pretty good hint that this data should come from the body of the request. And you can use it on one and only one parameter in your API, or in your operation method in this case. Notice also the name of the method is post, so that's directly tying to the HTTP operation. By the way, the method doesn't have to be called just post. What Web API requires is that the name of the method begins with get or post or put or delete. So you'll see later that we're probably going to have any number of get requests in a particular controller, and we can call those requests, get by name, get by state, get by whatever. As long as they start with the word get, then it will match the pattern that's required. This code, basically all it's doing is it's allocating newperson.id is if people.count is greater than 0, so this is a ternary expression, we're basically saying if people.count is greater than 0, people.order by descending, selecting the first item and its ID property and adding 1 to it, okay? So find the highest member of the collection, find its ID and add 1, or the value is 1 if there's nothing in the collection. Okay? That's just a controverted way of saying let's have the next ID value. Now clearly in the real world you're probably going to be going out to some system parameter file and saying what's the next available order number or the next available whatever, or however you would normally do it. But for a hard-coded example that's fine. And then we're just adding into our collection new person. Okay? So let's build that, and while it's building we should be able to hop on over to Postman. Now this is basically the format of what we're going to need. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm going to go back to our get. I'm going to change it to a post, which is a create, not passing in a value in the URL. We are going to go to our body and into the raw view, and I'm going to paste in that data. I'm going to remove the ID, and then I'm going to go to headers, because if we're passing data to the server, we need to specify the type of the data. So I'm going to add a new request header called content, see, IntelliSense content type, and it is application/JSON. So we're telling the server that we're sending you JSON, by the way. And if we do a save as, and we'll call it create person. And actually, let's just change the data to a name we don't have. Let's call it, okay, so we'll create a Susan Doe. API values. I copied the wrong one. API people. And that's pretty much it. So if we now hit send, again, just-in-time build, first time we've run it. We got a 204 no content, which is an appropriate response to a successful create, so it defaults to that. There's no content coming back, but the fact that we got a 200 series suggests, yes, it did it. So if we go ahead and reselect our get all people test and run that, and look at the pretty view. Okay, so there's our create operation. And again, when we do the create, what happened was, let's do another one, let's create person, send. You'll notice we are getting a 204 no content. We really should be getting a 201 created, okay? And we really should be getting a location header that tells us where the new item is. But again, one step at a time, we'll come on to those things a little bit later. Let's put our final action in here for our CRUD environment to update a person. So that one is fairly similar to the create. So let's go to Visual Studio and into our class, let's put our put method. We'll put the documentation comments on there just to. So this time we're passing in an ID via the query string. We're using a put method, and also via the body, we're passing in something called updated person. Briefly, again, the code is this piece of link is basically trying to match by ID the person in the existing collection, and if it's found, it stores the ID in the person that was passed in, and it then updates the collection with the passed in object. If we pass in one that doesn't match, in this case, it's just going to do nothing. So again, it's not ideal, but we'll address that later when we look at exception handling. So just a little hard-coded data. Okay, let's do our build. Let's create our test. So this one we can do fastest if we copy the create, headers, body. We'll do that, and we're going to change this to a put, and we're going to tell it which ID we're passing in, /3. So we're updating person 3, and Susan's becoming Simon. There we go. So save as Susan becomes Simon, and we'll save that. Now, what's going to happen first off is pretty much nothing, because, and we haven't got any code that detects failure. It wouldn't match, okay? Because I've just done a rebuild and my data is hard-coded in static memory. So we're starting off with an empty collection again. So if I do a get all people, because that was the first method I did, I'm only expecting to see 1 and 2. Okay, but if I now go and say, okay, the collection, it's a static collection, it's up and running inside my IIS process at this point in time. So if I now say create a person, so now we've done a create person, so now if we do a get all people, we've got John, Jane, and Susan, and now person 3 exists in the runtime environment. So if we call our update method, it comes back with 204 no content, and if we do a get all people, sure enough, Simon. Okay? So I can't just test it by calling that method straight off, because person 3 doesn't exist because the environment's just been recreated because of the build. So we have to run something to populate the collection, then create, then update, just because of this test scenario. And again, 204 was an appropriate response in that case. And one more, we've got the delete. So let's just do this so that we've got a complete service. So we'll copy the code there, and we'll come into our code and paste in the delete. And again, the delete is just using first or default to find a match based on ID. And if it finds a match, it just removes the item from the collection. Again, I'm not doing anything special. If there is no match, we will address that when we look at how to do exception handling and how to take control of return statuses and so on. But for now, it will just say, yeah, okay, and it will either have done it or not. So again, if we do a build of that, oh, I didn't put the dot comments in, but let's just put those in so that they're there. And again, if we go and take our get person 1, which is very similar, and we change it to a delete operation and save it as, well, let's do a delete person 3. So we'll change that because that's the one we're creating. Save. So again, I need to get things up and running. I'll call the get all to start with. Again, it rebuilds. We've got 1 and 2. Now we can call the create person, prove it happened by doing the get all. There's our 1, 2, and 3. And now if we call delete person 3, we should get a 204 no content. So it returned a successful status. And sure enough, if we look at the people list again, 3 is gone. Okay. The problem right now is if we call delete person 3 again, it's just going to say, yeah, okay, fine. Which maybe that's the response you want. Maybe you don't care about, they ask you to delete something and it doesn't exist anyway. You did what they wanted, right? So maybe 204 is what you want to return. It depends on your API. So there's basically the process of implementing a pretty much complete test scenario using some more realistic data. So now we've got a Synergy.NET Web API controller with the basic 5 get all, create, read, update, and delete operations. Once you've got that basic functionality, you can extrapolate that to build any kind of API you want, really. And we're using a model class. So, the data is hard-coded, which isn't that realistic, but all the major mechanisms that we need to build a real API are in place now.